This video will help the surviving spouse of someone who recently passed understand what your options are when it comes to inheriting their retirement accounts. If you don't know who I am, my name is Chris Dime. I'm a financial planner out of Edmonds, Washington, and I specialize in working with folks to and through retirement. One of the most common recipients for a retirement account is the surviving spouse of the decedent. However, the rules for a surviving spouse to inherit a retirement account are different than any other demographic. And there's a little bit of nuance to be aware of. So in today's video, we'll break down that nuance so that you understand what your options are. So let's jump in. With the passing of the Secure Act 1.0 back in 2019 and then the Secure Act 2.0 in the end of 2022, as well as some new changes that are coming into effect at the beginning of 2024, since all these changes have caused a lot of confusion out there in the industry, I thought it'd be helpful to clarify what the options are for the surviving spouse. In fact, these updated rules have been so confusing that the IRS has actually forgiven people forgetting to take out required minimum distributions or not knowing that they needed to for the past 3 years since the passing of the Secure Act 1.0. Now that's for a specific demographic. You can check out my previous videos on that to know if that forgiveness applied to you. We'll see what happens for 2024, but the rules have been very confusing for a lot of consumers out there, even advisors, but not this advisor, of course. This is important because generally in the traditional household where maybe one spouse is employed by an employer and they contribute to a retirement account and the other spouse is not employed, the surviving spouse who was not employed, their main driver of success in retirement could be the inheritance of that retirement account. So it's important to know what your options are when you inherit a retirement account from a spouse. So for a quick refresher, the IRS breaks down IRA beneficiaries into 3 categories: eligible designated beneficiaries, which is the surviving spouse, and then a few other demographics, non-eligible designated beneficiaries, which is everybody else, and then non-designated beneficiaries. And those are institutions like trusts, charities, etc. So specifically, this video applies to surviving spouses, which are eligible designated beneficiaries and have their own unique rules on top of the other demographics of eligible designated beneficiaries. So the first step to figure out what your options are is to find out if the spouse who recently passed had met their required beginning date or not. The required beginning date is the date in which the decedent needed to start taking out their required minimum distributions, which is generally in early mid-70s. So of course, if someone passed away in their 60s, they didn't meet their required beginning date. If they passed away in their 80s or later, then they definitely met their required beginning date. So let's tackle the situation where someone inherits a retirement account from someone who did not meet their required beginning date. So you have 2 main options. Option 1, you can mark this retirement account as your own retirement account. If it's a inherited traditional IRA, it'd become your own traditional IRA. If it's an inherited Roth IRA, you would mark it as your own Roth IRA. And all the rules that pertain to contributions, conversions, etc. apply to you just the same as if it was your own money. It also means that if you are well under the age of 59 and a half, if you were to try to take money out of these retirement accounts after classifying them as your own accounts, then you will face most likely a 10% early withdrawal penalty. So generally, if someone is well under the age of 60, you'd probably want to go with option number 2. Option number 2 is where you mark this account as an inherited retirement account. And again, if it's a traditional IRA you inherit, it's an inherited traditional IRA. And if it's a Roth IRA you inherit, it's an inherited Roth IRA. Once you mark it as an inherited IRA, you've got a few sub options to choose from, so we'll cover those. As the surviving spouse, you are permitted to delay required minimum distributions until the decedent would have met their required beginning date. Now, if you as the beneficiary are a lot older than the decedent, that could make a lot of sense because there's a lot more time for that money to compound before the IRS comes over and starts saying you must take out required minimum distributions. Now, new for 2024 is if you want to make this election, you must proactively make the election on those beneficiary inheritance forms. And the investment custodian that holds these funds will have these forms for you to fill out. Another sub option, once you mark this account as an inherited retirement account, is to take distributions based on your own life expectancy. And that's called a stretch IRA or stretch Roth IRA. This is very valuable if you're well under the age of 60 and this is your primary driver of cash flow success, aka meeting your grocery bills and paying your bills, is the reliance on this account. A stretch IRA can make a lot of sense because if you're well under the age of 60, you can still take out a little bit of the account and even more in an accelerated fashion to meet your needs. And you won't be hit with a 10% early withdrawal penalty nor if it's a Roth IRA would you be hit with income taxes, most likely. Your third option is to elect the 10-year rule. Now I've covered this in some previous videos, but ultimately the 10-year rule says in years 1 through 9, following the year in which the person passed away, you will not have to take out any sort of required minimum distributions. You can just let this money compound and grow. However, in the 10th year, you will need to liquidate the entire account. Now, of course, you could liquidate the account much faster than that, but that's generally not advisable. Because unless you have an immediate need for the money, you might as well let this money compound in a tax-deferred environment for 9 years. There are some circumstances where you might want to proactively take money out, especially if it's a pre-tax IRA, because maybe it makes more sense to kind of level out the income taxes you'll ultimately pay over a 10-year span, because in that 10th year, that'd be a pretty massive income tax hit, but that's up to your unique situation. And, based on your income needs, it might not even matter. We'll transition real quick to what your options would be if the decedent had met their required beginning date. But before we do that, keep in mind an inherited Roth IRA is always treated as if it was an account you inherit before the decedent met their required beginning date. And that's because Roth accounts, as of now, do not have required minimum distributions, whether it's a 401k, IRA, or whatever. So technically, nobody ever meets their required beginning date as it pertains to Roth IRAs. So the IRS says if you inherit a Roth IRA, even if the decedent was 90 years old, you're allowed to treat it as an account you inherit before they met their required beginning date. So the previous options we just talked about would apply to you. Let's transition to if after the person met their required beginning date. What are your options? So you pretty much have two options. Number one, you can mark this account as your own account once again, and all the pros and cons that we just talked about apply, or you can choose to mark this account as an inherited account and choose the stretch IRA options. So specifically, the 10-year rule is now off the table. Now, you might be thinking ahead and going, okay, if the decedent had met their required beginning date, what if the surviving spouse was older than the decedent? Wouldn't both options, either choosing a stretch IRA based on my own life expectancy or the beneficiary's life expectancy, or choosing to mark this account as my own retirement account, wouldn't those result in the exact same thing? And the answer is yes. So I'm not quite sure why you are permitted both options if you're older than the decedent, but just know either direction you go, it's going to be the same result. You're going to have to take out a required minimum distribution. The only downside in electing an inherited retirement account option as opposed to just making it your own retirement account is you're not allowed to do things like contributions or conversions or whatever. So generally, it would make more sense to just call it your own retirement account if you're older than the decedent and the decedent had met their required beginning date. If you want to know what the rules were before 2020, I'll cover that at the very end of this video. It's not applicable nowadays for anybody that passes away now or in the future, but some folks like to know kind of what their options were in the past, so we'll cover that in a second. So hopefully that was helpful in breaking down what the options are for a surviving spouse. Well, of course, it's somewhat of a morbid subject, and of course, I doubt when someone does have a loved one pass, they're going to want to do a bunch of research into their options. It's good to be proactive and understand what these rules are, whether or not the situation directly applies to you, because it could apply to someone you know, and they might rely on you for some guidance. So hopefully that was helpful. If you have further questions, drop them in the comments below or get in touch on the website. We'll help you get squared away. Have an awesome rest of your week. We'll talk to you later. Bye. So if someone passed away before their required beginning date, then the surviving spouse had two options. One, mark this account as their own retirement account, maybe roll it over to their existing IRA, or they could choose to mark it as an inherited retirement account. And the two sub options in that department are number one, marking the account as a stretch IRA, and we've talked about how that works with required minimum distributions based on your own life expectancy or the surviving spouse's life expectancy, or they could have elected the 5-year rule as an inherited retirement account. And what that means is in years 1 through 4 following the year of death, there are no required minimum distributions, and so that'd be nice. You get a little bit more compounding going on in a tax-deferred environment. But in that 5th year, you have to fully liquidate the account, and generally, if it's a pre-tax IRA, that's all going to be income taxable. So pros and cons. In the event someone inherited the account after the decedent met their required beginning date, then their only option would be to elect the stretch IRA. And that's where you take out distributions every year based on your life expectancy or the decedent's life expectancy. So hopefully that was helpful in kind of breaking down what the rules were back in the day.